They say a marriage built for appearances has no heart, until the night the Duke chose to give it one. The grand ballroom of Blackwell Manor shimmered beneath 1,000 crystal chandeliers, their golden lights spilling across polished marble floors and silk gowns that whispered with every measured step. At the center of it all stood Duchess Evelyn Blackwell, her spine straight despite the tremor threatening her breath, her gloved hands folded with quiet dignity as the murmurs closed around her like a tightening circle. The orchestra faltered. A folded letter, held delicately between Lady Madeline Crow's fingers, was raised for all to see. How unfortunate, the woman purred, her voice carrying across 20 feet of glittering guests, that our dear Duchess was never meant for this title. A ripple of laughter followed, soft, restrained, crueler for its refinement. Evelyn did not lower her gaze. She had been married for precisely 3 months, 3 measured months of polite dinners, distant conversations, and a husband who had treated their union like a signed contract rather than a vow. Duke Harrison Blackwell stood near the far archway, 6 feet 2 inches of composed authority, dark suit immaculate, expression carved from stone. He had agreed to the marriage to steady his family's political alliances. She had agreed to save her father's collapsing estate. Love had not been part of the negotiation. The letter fluttered open. Whispers sharpened. The implication was clear enough. Evelyn was an ornament, a convenience, perhaps even an embarrassment polished into silk. For a single suspended second, humiliation pressed against her ribs. She felt the weight of 100 watching eyes, the faint scent of champagne and roses turning suffocating in her lungs. Somewhere in the room, someone said, "She doesn't belong." And then Harrison moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady stride across polished stone, the sound of his shoes echoing with deliberate calm. Conversations dimmed as he stepped into the circle, his gray eyes resting not on the letter, not on Lady Madeline, but on his wife. For the first time since their wedding day, he truly looked at her. He saw the pride she refused to surrender, the quiet strength beneath the silk, the dignity that no whisper could erase. Evelyn felt him before she dared meet his gaze. The air shifted. His hand reached for hers. Firm, certain, not possessive but protective. A collective breath stilled the room. Harrison lifted her chin gently, his voice low enough that only she heard the first words. "You will not stand alone." And then, before the murmurs could rise again, he kissed her. Not scandalous, not hurried. A slow, deliberate declaration beneath the glow of crystal light. The laughter died. The letter slipped from Lady Madeline's hand. When Harrison finally drew back, his arm remained around Evelyn's waist, anchoring her to him in front of every witness. His voice carried now, steady and unyielding. "My Duchess requires no explanation." Silence answered him. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the space between husband and wife, where a contract had once been, and something far more dangerous had just begun. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like frost melting beneath cautious sunlight. Conversations resumed in careful fragments, but no one dared laugh again. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell remained where she stood, her fingers still curled lightly against the front of her husband's jacket, aware of the steady rise and fall of his breath. The warmth of his hand at her waist felt unfamiliar, almost startling, not because it was improper, but because it was intentional. Duke Harrison Blackwell had never touched her in public beyond the measured courtesy required of their roles. Tonight, there had been nothing measured about it. Lady Madeline Crow recovered first. Her smile returned, thinner now, strained at the edges. "How touching," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "It appears I misjudged the depth of your union." Harrison did not look at her. His gaze remained on Evelyn, as if the crowded ballroom had dissolved into shadow and only she remained in focus. "You misjudged many things," he replied evenly. No raised tone, no dramatics. Yet the quiet authority in his words settled over the room like a verdict. The orchestra, sensing the shift, resumed a waltz. Couples moved cautiously back to the floor, though more than a few continued to watch from the corners of their eyes. Harrison lowered his hand from Evelyn's waist, but did not release her fingers. "Walk with me," he said softly. It was not a command. It was not distant. It was something else entirely. Evelyn inclined her head, allowing him to guide her toward the tall arched doors that opened onto the terrace. Cool night air greeted them, brushing against flushed skin and silken fabric. Beyond the stone balustrade, the Blackwell estate stretched across rolling acres, moonlight tracing silver lines over manicured lawns and distant oak trees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music drifted faintly through the glass behind them. "You did not have to do that," Evelyn said at last, her voice steady though her heart still echoed from the shock of it. Harrison rested his hands along the stone railing, shoulders squared, expression thoughtful rather than cold. "Yes," he answered after a measured pause. "I did." She studied him in profile, noticing details she had never allowed herself to consider before: the tension along his jaw, the faint crease between his brows that appeared not from anger but from restraint. "You made a spectacle," she said gently. "We agreed to avoid those." A faint breath escaped him, almost a humorless laugh. "I have allowed too many spectacles at your expense." The admission settled between them, fragile and unexpected. Evelyn turned her gaze toward the dark horizon. "It was only gossip." "No," Harrison replied quietly. "It was an attack on my Duchess." The word sounded different now. Not contractual, not distant. Claimed. She felt it in the way he said it, in the weight he gave it. "You married me for stability," she reminded him, more to steady herself than to accuse. "I understood the terms." He faced her fully then, gray eyes no longer distant but searching. "I believed stability required distance," he said. "Tonight I realized distance invites cruelty." The wind lifted a loose strand of her hair, brushing it against his sleeve. He did not step away. Instead, he reached up, carefully tucking it back into place, his touch restrained yet unmistakably gentle. "They will talk more now," she whispered. "Let them," he answered. "They will speak of what they witnessed." "And what was that?" Evelyn asked softly. Harrison held her gaze, something unguarded flickering behind the composure he had worn like armor for years. "They witnessed that you are not alone," he said. And for the first time since the ink dried on their marriage contract, Evelyn felt the faint, undeniable shift of something deeper taking root between them. The night air lingered between them long after the music inside swelled into confident notes again, and when they finally returned to the ballroom, it was no longer as strangers bound by agreement, but as something far more observed. Conversations softened when they entered. Eyes followed. Yet no one stepped forward to challenge what had already been claimed. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell felt the weight of attention differently now. It no longer pressed against her like judgment. It hovered, uncertain, recalculating. Duke Harrison Blackwell offered his arm, not out of obligation, but with quiet intention, and she accepted it with a composure that no longer masked fear, but steadied strength. They moved through the room together, pausing when required, exchanging polite acknowledgments with guests who seemed newly cautious. A senator from Boston inclined his head with exaggerated respect. A business magnate who had once spoken over Evelyn now addressed her directly. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Power had changed shape in the space of a single, deliberate act. Yet as the evening wore on, Evelyn sensed something else beneath the polished surface. Lady Madeline Crowe had not departed. She remained near the orchestra, gloved hands folded, expression smooth as glass. When her gaze met Evelyn's across the room, there was no longer open mockery, but calculation. Harrison felt it too. "She will not yield easily," he murmured under his breath as they paused beside a marble column. "She does not have to," Evelyn replied softly. "The room has already chosen its version of events." Harrison studied her profile, noticing the calm resolve that had replaced earlier vulnerability. "You are not angry," he observed. "I was," she admitted. "But anger would have served her better than me." A faint warmth flickered in his eyes, something close to admiration. "You continue to surprise me," he said. "You never asked what I would do if I were cornered." "And what would you do?" he asked quietly. Evelyn's lips curved, not into triumph, but into quiet certainty. "I would stand," she answered, "and allow them to see who truly falters." As if summoned by the words, Lady Madeline approached at last, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. "Your Grace," she said smoothly to Harrison, though her eyes lingered on Evelyn. "A most dramatic display. I trust it was worth the attention." Harrison did not tighten his grip. He did not raise his voice. "Everything worth protecting is," he replied evenly. A delicate pause followed. The orchestra swelled into another waltz, and couples began to gather again. Madeline's gaze flicked briefly toward Evelyn's hand resting confidently on her husband's sleeve. "One must hope such devotion remains consistent," she said lightly. Evelyn met her eyes without hesitation. "One must hope truth remains louder than rumor," she returned, her tone calm, unshaken. For a heartbeat, the tension between them shimmered like heat above summer pavement. Then Madeline inclined her head and stepped away, retreating not in defeat, but in temporary restraint. Harrison exhaled slowly once she was gone. "You handled that with more grace than I deserved," he said quietly. Evelyn looked up at him, searching his expression in the glow of candlelight. "You chose to stand beside me," she replied. "That changes more than you realize." He held her gaze longer this time, no longer shielded by formality. "Perhaps," he said, voice low, "it changes more than I intended." And somewhere beneath the chandeliers and watchful eyes, beneath contracts and expectations, a new understanding began to take shape, fragile but undeniable, like the first thaw of spring after a long and guarded winter. The final notes of the waltz dissolved into applause, and the evening began its slow descent toward departure, yet nothing felt as it had at the start of the night. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, crystal glasses still caught reflections like scattered stars, but Duchess Evelyn Blackwell sensed the undercurrent beneath every polite farewell. Eyes lingered longer. Bows dipped lower. Whispers no longer carried laughter, only speculation. Duke Harrison Blackwell remained at her side as though it were the most natural position in the world, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a quiet reassurance that no one could mistake for accident. When the last guests began stepping into waiting carriages beneath the crescent moon, Harrison escorted Evelyn toward the grand staircase of the manor. The marble steps gleamed beneath soft candlelight, their ascent silent except for the faint rustle of silk and the steady rhythm of measured footsteps. Halfway up, Evelyn paused. The doors below had closed. The estate had grown still. "Tonight will follow us," she said softly, her voice echoing gently in the vast hall. Harrison did not pretend otherwise. "It will," he answered, "and so will what I chose to do." She studied him in the quiet, free now from the scrutiny of 100 guests. Without the audience, his composure seemed less rigid, more thoughtful. "Why did you choose it?" she asked. The question was not accusation. It was invitation. Harrison rested one hand against the cool stone banister, gaze lifting briefly toward the towering ceiling as though the answer might be written there. "Because I realized I have allowed others to define you within these walls," he said at last. "And that was a failure on my part." The word failure sounded unfamiliar in his voice, like something rarely spoken. Evelyn felt the weight of it, heavier than the rumors of the ballroom. "You married me to strengthen alliances," she reminded him gently. "I understood the distance." He looked back at her then, gray eyes steady but no longer guarded. "Distance is one thing," he said quietly. "Indifference is another." The distinction lingered between them, fragile and significant. A servant crossed the far end of the hall, footsteps soft, head respectfully bowed, and then disappeared into the west corridor. Silence returned. Harrison took another step upward, stopping one stair above her, not towering but close enough that she felt the warmth of him without the need for contact. "You deserved more than a title," he continued. "You deserve protection." Evelyn's breath steadied. "I did not ask for protection." "No," he agreed. "You did not." His expression shifted, not stern, not distant, but resolute. "Which is precisely why I offered it." The words carried no dramatic flourish, only conviction. She held his gaze, searching for calculation, for strategy, for any trace of the contractual tone that had marked their early days. She found none. Instead, she saw something steadier, something chosen. "If this changes," she said carefully, "it must change fully." Harrison did not hesitate. "Then let it," he replied. The air between them felt altered, charged not with scandal, but with possibility. Beyond the tall windows, the estate stretched across acres of quiet land, dark and enduring beneath the night sky. Inside those stone walls, something equally enduring had begun to shift, not from spectacle, not from obligation, but from a decision made in the center of humiliation and carried forward into the stillness that followed. And as they ascended the remaining steps side by side, The distance that once defined their marriage felt smaller than it ever had before. Morning arrived with a quietness that felt almost deliberate, as though Blackwell Manor itself understood that something had shifted within its walls. Pale sunlight filtered through tall arched windows, casting long ribbons of light across polished floors. And dark wood paneling. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell stood at the window of her sitting room, the estate stretching across nearly 200 acres beyond the glass, silver mist lifting slowly from the lawns. The events of the previous night lingered not as embarrassment, but as awakening. She had expected distance this morning. She had expected the careful civility that had defined the first months of her marriage. Instead, a knock sounded at her door precisely at 8 o'clock. Not a servant's knock. A measured one. "Enter," she said, steadying herself. Duke Harrison Blackwell stepped inside, already dressed for the day, dark jacket immaculate, expression composed but not distant. In his hand, he carried a small leather folio. "I thought you should see this before it reaches the papers," he said. He crossed the room and placed the folio on the table near her. Evelyn opened it carefully. Inside lay a draft statement prepared for distribution to every major social publication in Boston and New York. It was brief, direct. It acknowledged the previous evening's gathering and affirmed the strength and unity of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell. No defensiveness. No explanation. Only certainty. She looked up at him. "You are making it official," she observed. "It already was," he replied. "Now it will be visible." There was no trace of hesitation in his voice. Only decision. Evelyn closed the folio gently. "Visibility invites scrutiny," she said. "It does," he agreed. "But it also sets boundaries." He moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away, yet near enough that she felt the quiet gravity of his presence. "I have allowed others to define the terms of this marriage," he continued. "That ends now." She searched his face, looking for strategy, for calculation. Instead, she found something simpler. "Resolve." "And what are the new terms?" she asked softly. Harrison's gaze held hers without wavering. "Partnership," he said. The words settled in the room like something fragile and profound. Evelyn felt her breath slow, not from uncertainty, but from recognition. "Partnership requires honesty," she said. "It does," he replied. A pause followed, heavy not with tension, but with anticipation. "Then allow me to begin," he continued. "Last night was not obligation. It was choice." The distinction mattered, more than she had realized. She stepped closer, closing the small space between them until only a foot remained. "You chose to stand beside me," she said. "But standing beside me will require more than one public gesture." A faint warmth touched his expression, not amusement, but acknowledgement. "Then I will choose again," he answered. Outside, the mist had fully lifted. Sunlight now stretched boldly across the grounds, illuminating stone and grass alike. Within those walls, the atmosphere felt equally altered. The silence between them no longer carried uncertainty. It carried promise. And as Harrison extended his hand toward her, not commanding but inviting, Evelyn placed her fingers in his with quiet confidence, understanding that what had begun in defense was becoming something neither contract nor expectation had anticipated, something steadier, something deliberate, something chosen. The statement was released before noon, carried quietly through trusted channels, and by late afternoon the response had begun to ripple across the city. Blackwell Manor remained outwardly composed, its tall windows reflecting a sky of pale blue and drifting clouds. Yet inside the study on the east wing, Duke Harrison Blackwell stood before his desk reading the first printed column that mentioned his name. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell sat across from him, posture straight, hands folded calmly in her lap. The article was respectful, cautious. It described unity, strength, and an unshakable partnership. It also mentioned the previous evening without details, only noting that any doubts about the Duchess had been thoroughly dispelled. Harrison set the paper down. "It has begun," he said quietly. Evelyn rose and walked toward the window overlooking the front drive, where carriages occasionally passed along the gravel road beyond the iron gates. "Let them speak," she replied, "as long as they speak truth." He watched her reflection in the glass. "Truth," he repeated, as though testing the weight of it. "There is something you should know." She turned back to face him. His expression had shifted, not guarded, but deliberate. "The letter that was displayed last night," he continued, "was traced this morning. It was commissioned. The word lingered in the air. Evelyn's gaze did not falter. "By Lady Madeline?" she asked. Harrison inclined his head slightly. "Indirectly. She did not sign her name, but the source leads to her household." A lesser woman might have reacted with indignation. Evelyn did not. Instead, she walked back toward the center of the room, the soft brush of her skirt the only sound between them. "And what will you do?" she asked. "I can confront her publicly," he replied. "Expose the fabrication. And her influence." His tone remained steady, yet beneath it lay restrained force. Evelyn considered him for a moment. "If you confront her, you elevate her," she said quietly. "If you ignore her, she will seek another path." Harrison studied her, recognizing the strategic clarity in her voice. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. She stepped closer, stopping within 2 feet of him. "We host," she said, "another gathering. Larger, more visible. And this time, I will speak." He looked at her carefully. "You would place yourself at the center again." "I already stand there," she replied. "The difference is that this time, I choose it." Silence followed, not uncertain, but contemplative. Harrison felt a shift within himself as he watched her. The woman who had once agreed to a calculated marriage now stood before him not as ornament, not as obligation, but as equal. "Very well," he said at last. "We will host." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, not with triumph, but with resolve. "No retaliation," she added. "No threats. Only truth." Harrison nodded slowly. "And if she attempts another move? Then she will reveal herself without our assistance," Evelyn answered. The afternoon light deepened, casting long shadows across the study floor. Outside, the estate remained calm, yet both of them understood that the quiet was temporary. The next evening would not be about defense. It would be about presence. And as Harrison stepped closer, closing the final space between them, he realized that this was no longer a strategy he was executing alone. It was a path they were choosing together. The invitations were sent before dusk, embossed in gold, sealed with the Blackwell crest, and delivered by uniformed staff who carried them like declarations rather than requests. By sunrise the following day, every influential name from Boston to Manhattan knew that Blackwell Manor would open its doors again within the week. This time, the gathering would not be quiet. This time, it would be deliberate. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell stood in the center of the grand ballroom as preparations began, sunlight pouring through the 20-foot windows and illuminating ladders, polished silver trays, and lengths of ivory silk being draped along the balconies. The room no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a stage reclaimed. Duke Harrison Blackwell watched from the upper landing, his hands resting against the carved oak, railing as he observed her moving across the marble floor with calm authority. Servants listened when she spoke. Designers adjusted at her suggestion. There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of the woman who had once endured whispers without response. When she noticed him above, she did not look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a brief moment, steady and certain, as though reminding him that this was not merely his house. It was theirs. Later that afternoon, a note arrived. The envelope bore no crest, only a single elegant script line addressed to the Duchess. Harrison opened it beside her in the study. The message was brief. One must admire courage when it presents itself so publicly. No signature was required. Evelyn folded the paper once and placed it calmly on the desk. "She will attend," Harrison said quietly. "Of course she will," Evelyn replied. "She will expect spectacle." He studied her expression carefully. "And what will she receive?" Evelyn stepped closer to the tall window, sunlight catching in her hair. "Clarity," she answered. The word carried neither threat nor hesitation. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate and lanterns were lit along the stone pathways, Harrison found her again in the ballroom. The space was nearly ready now, chandeliers polished, fresh white roses arranged along the perimeter, a quartet rehearsing near the far archway. "You do not appear anxious," he observed. She turned toward him, her gown simple but elegant, posture unwavering. "Anxiety suggests doubt," she said softly. "I have none." He descended the final steps and approached her, stopping just within reach. "You realize," he began, "that by placing yourself at the center, you risk further scrutiny." Evelyn met his eyes without flinching. "Scrutiny is not what frightens me," she said. "Silence does." The admission settled between them. Harrison reached for her hand, not out of necessity, but acknowledgement. "Then we will not be silent," he said. Across the vast room, the final candle was lit. Its flame flickered once, then steadied. The ballroom seemed to inhale in anticipation, aware that the next gathering would not repeat the past. It would redefine it. And as the evening shadows deepened beyond the windows, both of them understood that what began as defense had become declaration, not only to their society, but to each other. The night of the second gathering arrived with a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. Blackwell Manor stood illuminated against the dark sky, every window glowing like a promise kept. Carriages rolled along the curved drive in steady intervals, wheels crunching against gravel, drivers stepping down to open doors for figures dressed in silk and tailored black. Inside, the grand ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, white roses lining the balconies, their fragrance soft but unmistakable. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell stood at the top of the staircase before the first guest was announced, her gown a deep ivory that caught the candlelight without demanding it. Duke Harrison Blackwell stood beside her, not ahead, not distant, but aligned. When the doors opened and the first names were spoken, the room filled with the low hum of conversation and cautious curiosity. Eyes lifted toward the staircase almost immediately. They had come expecting spectacle. They found composure. Harrison offered his arm, and Evelyn descended with unhurried grace, every step deliberate, the marble cool beneath her feet. The quartet began a measured arrangement, the sound elegant, restrained. Conversation swelled and then quieted as more guests entered. Across the room, Lady Madeline Crowe arrived precisely 30 minutes into the evening, her gown a calculated shade of crimson, her posture flawless. She paused just inside the threshold, scanning the room, taking measure of its arrangement. It was not the setting she had anticipated. There was no tension in the air, no whispers cutting through corners. Instead, there was structure, calm, control. Harrison felt Evelyn's fingers rest lightly against his sleeve, not in uncertainty, but in awareness. "Are you prepared?" he asked quietly. She did not look at him. Her gaze remained forward. "I have been prepared since the first whisper," she answered. As the evening progressed, laughter began to return to the ballroom, but it no longer carried sharpness. It carried curiosity. Guests approached the Duchess with polite inquiries, compliments offered not out of obligation but recognition. Harrison remained near, though not overshadowing her presence. He observed the room carefully, noting how influence shifted like current beneath a still surface. At precisely 9 o'clock, Evelyn signaled to the quartet. The music softened, then stilled. Conversations faded. She stepped forward into the center of the floor, no raised platform, no grand announcement, only presence. 100 eyes turned toward her. Lady Madeline's expression remained unreadable, though her posture tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn's voice carried clearly without strain. "Thank you for joining us," she began, steady and composed. "This house has always represented strength, legacy, and unity. Those values are not defined by rumor, nor diminished by speculation." A pause followed, intentional, allowing the words to settle. "They are defined by integrity. No accusation, no names, only clarity." Harrison watched as the room absorbed her statement, as uncertainty dissolved into understanding. "I stand here not to defend myself," Evelyn continued, "but to affirm what has already been demonstrated. Partnership is not appearance. It is commitment." She did not glance at Harrison, yet the connection between them was unmistakable. When she finished, silence lingered for one measured breath. Then applause began, not hesitant, but rising in steady waves across the ballroom. Even those who had once whispered now joined, because alignment with strength was safer than resistance. Harrison stepped forward then, taking her hand openly, his voice calm but firm. "Blackwell stands united," he said simply. And in that moment, beneath crystal light and unwavering gazes, the narrative that had once sought to diminish her dissolved completely, replaced by something far more enduring. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled across the ballroom in steady waves, echoing against marble and crystal until even the most reluctant hands joined in. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell remained poised at the center, her fingers resting within Duke Harrison Blackwell's grasp, the warmth of his hand no longer surprising but anchoring. Around them, Conversations resumed, yet the tone had shifted entirely. No one whispered now. They spoke openly, voices filled with admiration rather than doubt. Harrison leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You have altered the room," he said. Evelyn allowed herself the faintest smile. "No," she replied softly. "We have." Across the polished floor, Lady Madeline Crowe stood motionless for a brief moment, crimson silk catching the light like a fading ember. The applause had not been directed at her. The power she once wielded through suggestion and subtle cruelty now felt diminished, not through confrontation, but through exposure. She inclined her head with measured grace and approached the Duke and Duchess once more, though this time there was no sharpness in her expression. "A remarkable address," she said evenly. "You have my compliments." Evelyn met her gaze without hostility. "Thank you," she answered, her tone neither triumphant nor defensive. There was nothing left to defend. Harrison watched the exchange carefully, prepared to intervene if necessary, yet none was required. Madeline's eyes flickered briefly, perhaps calculating another path, perhaps recognizing that the narrative had slipped beyond her reach. "I wish you both a pleasant evening," she concluded before retreating toward the far side of the room, where her presence no longer commanded attention. As the music resumed, couples returned to the floor with renewed energy. Harrison extended his hand once more, this time not as declaration, but invitation. "May I?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. Evelyn placed her hand in his, and together they stepped into the waltz, movements unhurried, synchronized without effort. The distance that had once defined their marriage had dissolved into rhythm. Guests observed not with skepticism, but with acknowledgement. It was evident now that what stood before them was not arrangement, but alignment. When the dance concluded, Harrison did not release her immediately. His gray eyes searched hers, free of calculation. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "You underestimated us," she corrected. The distinction lingered, meaningful and earned. Beyond the tall windows, the estate stretched beneath a sky scattered with stars, the air cool and steady. Inside, Blackwell Manor felt transformed, not by spectacle, but by truth spoken without fear. As the evening drew toward its end and the final guests prepared to depart, the Duke and Duchess remained side by side at the entrance hall, offering farewells with composed warmth. There were no lingering doubts in the eyes that met theirs. Only respect. When the doors finally closed and silence settled once more across the vast corridors, Harrison turned to Evelyn with quiet certainty. "This house stands stronger tonight," he said. She looked around the grand hall, its chandeliers dimmed, its marble floors reflecting faint light, and then back at him. "So do we," she replied. And within those enduring walls, beneath the crest that bore his name and now equally hers, partnership had become not appearance, but truth chosen in full view of the world. The manor grew quiet long after the final carriage disappeared beyond the iron gates, its wheels fading into the distance like an echo finally released. Candlelight dimmed along the corridors, and the scent of white roses lingered faintly in the air. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell stood in the center of the now empty ballroom, her reflection faintly visible. In the polished marble floor beneath her feet, Duke Harrison Blackwell approached from behind, his footsteps unhurried, the silence between them no longer fragile but steady. "You changed more than their minds tonight," he said quietly. Evelyn turned toward him, the weight of the evening settling gently rather than heavily upon her shoulders. "So did you," she replied. He paused a few feet away, studying her not as obligation, not as strategy, but as the woman who had chosen to stand rather than retreat. "When we first agreed to this marriage," he began slowly, "I believed control was strength. Distance was safety." His voice carried no pride in that admission, only recognition. Evelyn listened without interruption. "I thought affection would complicate clarity," he continued. "Instead, it was absence that complicated everything." She stepped closer, closing the space deliberately. "You did what you believed necessary," she said softly. "But necessity changes." The chandeliers above cast a softened glow, illuminating the sincerity in his expression. "It has," he agreed. "Because I have." The confession was simple, yet it resonated with a depth that no public declaration could replicate. Outside the tall windows, The night stretched wide and calm over the estate's 200 acres, the world beyond unaware of the quieter transformation occurring within those stone walls. Harrison reached for her hand again, not to defend, not to demonstrate, but to hold. "I do not want this to remain an alliance," he said steadily. "I want it to become a choice we continue to make." Evelyn felt the sincerity in his grip, the absence of calculation in his tone. "A partnership," she reminded him gently. "Yes," he answered, "but more than public unity. I want your counsel, your presence, your trust." The words settled deeply, not rushed, not dramatic. She searched his eyes carefully, looking for hesitation. There was none. "Trust is earned," she said quietly, "and you have begun." A faint warmth touched his expression, not triumph, but gratitude. "Then allow me to continue earning it," he replied. The ballroom around them felt different now, not because of applause or attention, but because of stillness. The stage had been cleared. The performance concluded. What remained was choice. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the last remnants of tension dissolving. "We will face scrutiny again," she said. "There will always be another whisper." Harrison inclined his head. "Then we will answer with truth," he said. "Not spectacle." She stepped fully into his space then, resting her hand against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm beneath tailored fabric. "And not silence," she added. His hand lifted gently to her shoulder, protective without possessiveness, grounding rather than commanding. "Never silence," he agreed. For the first time since their vows had been spoken beneath crystal light months ago, there was no distance left to measure between them. No calculated politeness. Only understanding. And as the final candle flickered low, Blackwell Manor stood not merely as a symbol of legacy, but as a witness to something far quieter and far stronger than reputation. It stood as proof that what began as appearance had become intention, and what was once agreement had transformed into devotion chosen freely, in full view of the world, and within the privacy of two steady hearts. The morning after the second gathering dawned clear and untroubled, sunlight spilling across the eastern lawns of Blackwell Manor and filtering through the tall windows of the private breakfast room. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell sat at the long mahogany table, a silver teacup resting untouched before her as she reviewed correspondence that had arrived overnight. The tone had shifted unmistakably. Invitations to charitable boards, requests for her presence at civic events, even personal notes expressing admiration for her composure. Across from her, Duke Harrison Blackwell watched quietly, observing not the letters, but the way she held them. No longer cautious. Confident. "They are aligning themselves," he said at last. Evelyn set one envelope aside and looked up. "They are aligning themselves with stability," she corrected gently. "Stability has a name now." Harrison considered that. "Yours," he said. She shook her head slightly. "Ours." The word carried weight, earned rather than assumed. Outside, the estate stretched nearly 200 acres beneath the brightening sky, the gravel drive already active with morning deliveries and departing staff. Life had resumed its rhythm, yet something fundamental felt altered, not because of applause, not because of public acknowledgement, but because the distance that once defined their partnership had been replaced by intention. A discreet knock sounded at the door. The steward entered with composed professionalism. "Your Grace," he said to Harrison, "Lady Madeline Crowe has requested a private audience." The air shifted subtly. Evelyn did not look surprised. Harrison's expression remained steady, though his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "When?" he asked. "This afternoon," the steward replied. "She has expressed urgency." Harrison dismissed him with a nod. Silence settled between husband and wife once more. "You expected this," he observed. Evelyn folded her hands calmly atop the table. "Yes," she answered. "Influence rarely retreats quietly." He studied her carefully. "You do not seem concerned." She met his gaze evenly. "Concern suggests fear," she said. "I have none left to give her." The simplicity of the statement carried quiet strength. Harrison rose from his chair and crossed to stand beside her, looking down at the open letters scattered before her. "If she seeks reconciliation," he said thoughtfully, "will you grant it?" Evelyn considered the question not as strategist, but as Duchess. "I will grant civility," she replied. "Reconciliation requires accountability." Harrison's lips curved faintly at the precision of her answer. "You are formidable," he said quietly. "No," she answered with a calm breath. I am resolved. The word lingered between them, steady and grounded. Outside the window, a breeze stirred the trees lining the drive, sunlight catching in the leaves. Harrison rested one hand lightly against the back of her chair, not restraining, not commanding, but present. Then we will receive her together, he said. Evelyn rose slowly, meeting him face to face. Together, she echoed. The partnership they had chosen no longer felt theoretical. It was visible in small decisions, in shared responses, in the absence of silence. Whatever Lady Madeline intended to bring through those doors that afternoon, it would not find division waiting. And as the clock in the hallway struck 10 with measured clarity, Blackwell Manor stood prepared not for defense, but for continuation, its walls no longer holding distance, but unity strengthened in full light of day. Lady Madeline Crowe arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, her carriage wheels crunching over the gravel drive with measured restraint rather than spectacle. The afternoon sun cast long beams across the front steps of Blackwell Manor, illuminating carved stone and polished brass as the doors opened to receive her. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell stood in the west drawing room beside the tall windows overlooking the gardens, sunlight outlining her silhouette in quiet authority. Duke Harrison Blackwell stood at her side, not ahead, not behind, but aligned as promised. When Madeline entered, she wore no crimson this time. Her gown was a subdued gray, elegant but unassertive, as though acknowledging the shift that had occurred. She paused 3 feet from them and inclined her head with composed grace. Your Grace, she addressed Harrison, then turned her gaze toward Evelyn. Your Duchess. The distinction did not go unnoticed. Harrison gestured toward the seating area, his tone courteous but measured. Please, he said, state your purpose. Madeline did not sit immediately. Instead, she allowed a breath of silence to pass, as though weighing pride against necessity. I miscalculated, she said at last, her voice controlled. I underestimated the strength of your alliance. Evelyn studied her carefully. There was no sarcasm in the statement, only realism. Rumor thrives in silence. Evelyn replied evenly. It falters in light. Madeline's lips curved faintly, not in mockery, but acknowledgement. You have made that clear. Harrison remained silent, his presence steady but restrained, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. Madeline finally took a seat, smoothing her gloves against her lap. I have no interest in continuing a conflict that no longer serves me, she said plainly. The city respects strength. It no longer questions yours. Evelyn stepped forward slightly, closing the distance by a single pace. Respect cannot be negotiated through intimidation, she said. It must be chosen. Madeline's gaze lifted, meeting hers fully for the first time without challenge. Then allow me to choose differently, she replied. The admission carried more weight than apology might have. There was no dramatic contrition, only recognition of reality. Harrison folded his hands behind his back, his voice calm but firm. We will not revisit what has passed, he said, but we will expect integrity moving forward. Madeline inclined her head once more. You shall have it. Silence settled briefly, not hostile, but conclusive. Outside the windows, the estate garden stretched nearly 200 yards in careful symmetry, sunlight glinting off the fountain at the center. The world continued, indifferent to private reckonings. Evelyn spoke again, her tone neither cold nor warm. We are hosting a charitable gala next month to support the city hospital. You are welcome to attend. It was not invitation as surrender. It was invitation as boundary. Madeline rose slowly. I will consider it, she answered, then paused. For what it is worth, Duchess, you have handled this with remarkable composure. Evelyn did not smile in triumph. Composure, she said quietly, is simply clarity without fear. Madeline inclined her head one final time and departed, her footsteps measured, her departure unaccompanied by spectacle. When the doors closed behind her, Harrison exhaled softly. You offered partnership even to opposition, he observed. Evelyn turned toward him, sunlight catching in her eyes. Strength does not require enemies, she replied. Only conviction. And in the quiet that followed, Blackwell Manor stood not as battleground, but as testament to the power of dignity chosen over retaliation, unity chosen over division, and a marriage that had evolved beyond defense into deliberate, unwavering alliance. The afternoon light lingered long after Lady Madeline's carriage had disappeared beyond the gates, as though the estate itself wished to witness the quiet that followed. Blackwell Manor stood unchanged in stone and structure, yet something within its walls felt permanently altered. Duchess Evelyn Blackwell walked slowly through the west garden as evening approached, gravel shifting softly beneath her steps, the fountain at the center reflecting streaks of gold and rose from the setting sun. Duke Harrison Blackwell joined her without announcement, matching her pace easily, neither leading nor trailing. For a moment, they walked in silence, the air cool and steady across nearly 200 acres of carefully tended land. "It is finished," Harrison said at last, his voice calm but certain. Evelyn glanced toward the horizon where the last light touched the tops of the trees. "No," she replied gently. "It is begun." He studied her profile, recognizing that she no longer spoke as a woman defending herself, but as one shaping her future. "You could have chosen retaliation," he observed. "Many would have." She allowed a faint smile. "Retaliation binds you to what harmed you," she said. "Clarity frees you." The words settled between them with quiet finality. They reached the edge of the reflecting pond, its surface smooth as glass. Harrison stopped, turning toward her fully. "When we first stood in this garden after our wedding," he said, "I believed our path would remain defined by necessity." Evelyn remembered the day clearly. The measured vows, the calculated alliance, the distance that had felt like protection. "Necessity brought us here," she answered. "Choice keeps us here." He reached for her hand, not urgently, not defensively, but deliberately. "Then I choose you," he said. There was no audience, no chandeliers, no applause, only open sky and the steady sound of water against stone. Evelyn felt the sincerity in the words, simple yet profound. "And I choose you," she replied. The estate around them seemed to exhale, as though the land itself recognized the shift from agreement to devotion. Harrison lifted her hand gently to his lips, not as spectacle, but as promise. "We will face challenges again," he said. "Society forgets quickly. Then we will remember," she answered. "Not for them. For us." The sky deepened into twilight, the first stars appearing faintly overhead. In the quiet expanse of nearly 200 acres, Blackwell Manor stood not as a symbol of power alone, but as testament to resilience shaped by dignity. What began in scrutiny had evolved into strength. What began as arrangement had become alliance. And as they turned back toward the manor together, walking side by side beneath the emerging night, there was no longer distance to bridge, no performance to uphold. There was only the steady rhythm of two lives aligned by choice, proving that love does not grow in comfort, but in the shadows where courage refuses to bend, and that some hearts learn to beat in harmony only after they have chosen to stand unshaken before the world.